own system. The readings are not particularly long, and they are complementary to what you will be reading for the course anyway. So I hope that's not too much of an inconvenience for you. Please do take a quick look at the portal when it's put up. Don't waste too much time. I believe that you have 3 weeks to finish it. The precise date for the due date is on your syllabus, so don't take my word for it, because sometimes I get confused with all the classes I'm teaching as to where the particular due dates are. But suffice it to say, I think that it should be a fairly stimulating assignment, and I hope it gets you thinking. Toward that end, I wanted to take up a component of that that is theoretically important and that we have not dealt with in the class as much as perhaps we should, in order to some extent frame the discussions that are going to be expected of you on that assignment. And for that reason, I will take a brief detour today, not away from political economy as a whole, but rather toward a concept that I was planning on elaborating on somewhat later anyway, and that is hegemonic stability theory. Before I do that, however, I also wanted to briefly draw your attention to last week. You might recall that I began our discussion of international political economy by drawing your attention to the ongoing events in the Ukraine and the extent to which what appear to be political battles in the streets of Kiev have an underlying economic logic to them. In other words, they are, at least in part, a reflection of competing visions of a Ukrainian future. One with the Ukraine rooted in Western Europe and the European Union, and the other of the Ukraine being much more closely aligned and much more closely integrated into the Russian Federation. On that topic, I don't want to elaborate too much more. Suffice it to say that there were a few students that came down to ask further questions about it. And insofar as that you're interested in what's going on in Ukraine, and I think that it is something that all of us, if we're interested in international politics, should be interested in, because the outcome of that conflict will, to a substantial extent, shape European politics, and in particular shape the relationship between Russia and its neighbors for the foreseeable future. So it is something worth keeping an eye on. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that Democracy Now! This morning had a discussion between a member of the Ukrainian opposition who was obviously fairly sympathetic to those protesters and the project that they are trying to push forward, and Stephen Cohen, one of the preeminent scholars of Russian and Eastern European politics, discussing the ongoing problems in Ukraine. It's interesting, not in that they solved everything. In fact, the discussion probably generated more heat than it did light, and certainly did not lead to a consensus. Suffice it to say that the supporters of or the supporter in this case of the protest movement argued that the protest movement was pro-democratic, was very much rooted in Western liberal ideas of trying to integrate the Ukraine into Western Europe, and had been maligned by the Western media to some extent that has drawn attention to elements within that protest movement that seem to be notably fascist in their orientation and pretty far to the right. And several reports that seem to indicate, or that seem to argue, that the liberal forces that began the protest movement have in the meantime lost control over that movement to far more right-wing radical groups trying to put forward essentially a fascist kind of a future for the Ukraine. Stephen Cohen almost entirely disagreed with the supporter of the movement and argued precisely that, essentially, while the protest started out as a fairly moderate protest against the policies of Yanukovych, that since then is decidedly taking a more right-wing radical turn, and one that rejects compromise with what is an elected government, after all, that of Yanukovych. And that it reflects, to a certain extent, the kind of inflexibility on the part of the European Union, the inflexibility on the part of the European Union being somewhat understandable, given the condition that the European Union is currently in. Most of you, if you've been reading about the European Union, and even if you, as long as you have been entirely asleep over the last year or two, will know that the European Union is in deep trouble. It's in deep trouble in part because of the problems that persist in its southern flank countries, the countries generally identified as the pigs, which is not meant to be derogatory, but it's hard not to think of it as derogatory. PIGS stands for Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. God, they could have arranged that someday, rather than call them the pigs. Suffice it to say, these are the economies that are less developed than the core countries of the European Union, in particular France and Germany, and that found themselves in economic problems, essentially because they have incurred more and more debts, and that in turn reflects a balanced payment deficit between these entities within the European Union and other parts of the European Union, in particular Germany. They have been asking, pressuring the European Union essentially to provide more extensive credits to basically bail them out of their problems, to redistribute resources from the core countries like Germany to these peripheral countries within the European Union. And that has, for the most part, been met with flat rejection on the part of the powers within Brussels, in particular on the part of Germany, which is the dominant player, especially in regards to financial and economic matters within the European Union. Instead, the European Union has preached a kind of a rather severe austerity as the only way out for Spain, Portugal, Greece, and so on and so forth. And those austerity programs being implemented in the midst of an economic downturn, when unemployment levels are already rather high, seem to have thrown more fuel on the fire of the instability in places like Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. Under those circumstances, it is understandable that the European Union could not be particularly generous to the Ukraine in terms of signing agreements that would provide them with extensive credits and so on in order to get their economy off the ground and into a position where it can effectively compete within the European Union and thus eventually enter the European Union. Russia, by contrast, was somewhat more generous and offers $10 billion as an economic aid. But part of the condition for a closer alignment with Europe was the insistence by the Europeans that the Ukraine does not sign any agreements with Russia. In other words, it has become a kind of a zero-sum game between them. In any event, I don't want to repeat all of that, and some of you may not be all that interested in the Ukraine. Suffice it to say, however, if you're looking for an informative discussion of it, you can find that at democracynow.org, which is not a bad news program to keep an eye on anyway. It offers some pretty interesting insights on a number of international issues. Let me keep that aside for now and move on to today's topic, which, as I pointed out, is hegemonic stability theory. Can you all kind of read that, or is that thing? There's not a lot to do about it, right? Pardon me? Turn on
the picture of the front door.
But that's not as easy as one would. You gotta figure out this thing. Hegemonic stability theory. To begin with our discussion in this regard, let me pick up where we left off last class. Last class we looked at the three dominant approaches to understanding the relationship between politics and economics, in particular in its international dimensions. And we noted in this regard that on the one hand, were realists that tended to see politics as clearly dominant. In other words, they tended to argue that the economy invariably serves states rather than states serving the economy. And for the most part, it argued that in order to understand the relationship between politics and economics, we have to understand first and foremost the dominance of states and the interest that they have in economics and trade and so on, within the context of that overall zero-sum game of international politics, meaning that states certainly will engage in trade, and especially given the theoretical evidence that suggests that everyone that engages in trade is better off than they would be if they did not engage in trade internationally. States have a strong incentive to engage in trade. But they will do so only insofar as it enhances their own power. It will cease to do so when it strengthens others to a greater extent than themselves. Liberals see economic trade in far less problematic terms and tend to argue that there's a natural tendency for all states to engage in trade, to achieve these benefits, and that engaging in trade and capturing these benefits is to a large extent a kind of a one-way street. In other words, it will lead to greater and greater complex interdependencies between states that will make conflict less and less likely, and ultimately, if you follow that logic through to its conclusion, lead to a fully integrated world economy in which states become, and political boundaries with them, become less and less relevant. A good example of that vision of the relationship between states and economic integration is the current project that we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the European Union. The European Union consists, as most of you are aware, of states that have historically been at each other's throats almost continuously. Most notably, France and Germany, that in the preceding 2 centuries, before the establishment of the European Union, fought 4 bloody wars against each other, beginning with the Napoleonic Wars, then the Franco-Prussian War, and then World War I and World War II. And at the end of World War II, or even during World War II, if you had suggested that France and Germany can live peacefully side by side, and in fact can become the main champions of integration of Europe as a whole, most people probably would have laughed you out of the room. But that is precisely what has happened. Essentially, Europe has, or the Germany and France have become the main champions of political and economic integration in Europe. And as such, have followed a script that could have been written by liberal internationalists. The establishment of the European Union, and I don't want to go into too much detail in this regard at the moment, began in the early 1950s with the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Coal and Steel Community. And the purpose of that was essentially to create a single market, a single integrated market for coal and steel among its member states. And those member states were the core of what today is the European Union. Why coal and steel? Well, essentially because the authors of that project felt that coal and steel were the key industrial ingredients to fueling a war machine, were the key industrial ingredients in fueling the German war machine, both in World War I and World War II, and likewise the somewhat less effective French war machine in World War I and World War II. And that by integrating these 2 industries, between these two countries. A war between these two countries would become virtually unthinkable, or in any event, far, far less likely. That was the first step in creating the European Union, simply to integrate two crucial industries. But it grew out from that to eventually become the European Economic Community, which became a free trade zone within Europe, within Western Europe. The European Economic Community was transformed in the 1970s into what became known as merely the European Community. And in the early 1990s, as a result of the Maastricht Treaty, into the European Union. Meaning that these trade agreements that first focused exclusively on trade expanded increasingly toward creating institutions to facilitate that trade throughout Europe, and then eventually political institutions that could play a growing role in governing Europe as a whole. And the long-term aim today is quite self-consciously to eliminate the individual states within Europe and to create a supranational state of Europe. They're still a long ways from that. As much as they have adopted a European currency, which certainly would have been a crucial step in that direction, many economists argue that that step was taken prematurely, resulting in the problems with Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal, which they now seem to have a very difficult time solving. Had it not been for a unified currency, they would have been relatively simple to solve. Meaning that if Greece finds itself in excessive debt and can't get out of it, what happens is that you devalue the currency. And if you devalue the Greek currency, it makes importing things into Greece more expensive and makes Greek exports more competitive on European markets. And if you devalue it enough with respect to the other currencies within Europe, it will correct that balance of payments problem. Given that they no longer have their separate currency, there's no way of getting out of this problem. Other than massive transfer payments from the center to Greece, in other words, from Brussels to Greece, which are politically unacceptable to the governments of countries like Germany, since they would have to pay much of that. They have adopted a currency union, which certainly was an important step, even if it was premature. But that's still a long ways from creating a supranational organization. And they are still taking rather small baby steps in the direction of such a supranational organization. At the moment, the European Union only has those powers that were explicitly transferred to Brussels from the member states. And it is fairly explicit that each of those member states has the right to withdraw those powers from the European Union, and by implication, pull out. No one so far seems to have an interest in doing that. Even the Greeks and the Spanish don't have an interest in doing that, and certainly Germany does not have an interest in doing that for a number of complex reasons. But they are still a long ways from unification. A true unification will require that Europe has a unified foreign policy. And Europe is still a long ways from that. And that was well illustrated about 11 years ago in the build-up to the war with Iraq, where Donald Rumsfeld famously stated that Europe was split between the old Europe and the new Europe. And the old Europe was stuck in its old ways and was anti-American, and the new Europe, on the other hand, was more than willing to support the Americans in getting Saddam Hussein out of Iraq. If you look at the precise picture, it's pretty hard to figure out how something becomes old and how it becomes new. Britain is part of the new Europe because it supported the Americans, and Germany and France were part of the old Europe because they opposed it. Poland was part of the new Europe because it supported it, and so on and so forth. And that doesn't really make a heck of a lot of sense, but you get the general picture. In essence, when push came to shove on a foreign policy issue, many of the European countries did not see eye to eye and could not agree on a unified foreign policy. They have also not been able to agree on a unified security policy, and certainly are a long way from what would ultimately be required for Europe to fit the definition of a state, and that is a state has, as you might recall from our discussions last term, as its first and perhaps most important requirement, a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence within its own territory. The implication of that for our purposes here would be a unified police force, but much more importantly, a unified defense establishment. And so far, each individual country still maintains their own defense establishment, although they are starting to work toward cooperating with one another. In particular, the dominant two countries within the European Union at this point, Germany and France, seem to be aligning their foreign policy to a greater and greater extent and sharing in some of the military missions as well. I don't want to get too much into the European Union. Suffice it to say that the European Union is a good illustration of the kind of image of free trade of the economy that underlies the liberal vision of that relationship. Economics is dominant. Politics follows the interests of economics. Marxists, of course, were somewhat different again. They certainly agreed that, economics was dominant, but in a very different way. And I don't want to reiterate all of that. What I want to talk about today is an outgrowth of realism that has become known as hegemonic stability theory. It is an outgrowth of realism insofar as it is rooted, at least to some extent, in the mercantilist view of political economy. How so? In that supporters, like Robert Cohen and Robert Lichtman, argue that a liberal international economic order, such as the kind of free trade, globalized regime under which we are currently living, is not a natural development. No more so than was the creation of free markets on a national level, as I described last class. Free markets at the national level, according to realists, were created by states. By the way, if you're interested in the historical aspects of this, one of the best books on the subject is Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which focuses on the role that the states played in creating this free market system. Why did states create free market systems and replace their older system of much more regulated markets? In large part because it enhanced their power. It was in their interest to do so. And the implication is that if it ceased to be in their interest, they would very quickly withdraw, or rather, let's put it differently, restrict the functioning of markets to a greater and greater extent. And there's, of course, at least some evidence for that. If free trade is always beneficial, and if the interest in free trade tends to trump politics, then one would expect things like embargoes on a country like Cuba to disappear pretty quickly. Who would gain from that? But of course they haven't, and are not likely to in the short term. Suggesting that politics, at least in certain contexts, still trumps economic interests. Marxists, of course, agree for the most part that markets were not a natural phenomenon, but argue that the creation of markets was a reflection of the growth in economic power of those groups that benefited from the creation of such a free market. In other words, the bourgeoisie, as it emerged out of its existence as merchants and transformed itself into industrialists. And then as they become economically more powerful, they eclipse the old ruling elites associated with the more restricted kinds of markets of the Middle Ages and implement free trade. Well, in the same sense, realists argue that a liberal international economic order, an open world economy is another way of putting that, is likewise not a natural development, but is something that is created by political actors. And that the creation of such a liberal or open world economic order depends in crucial ways on the ability of a single state to impose such a system. In other words, it requires a dominant hegemonic power. A dominant hegemonic power. And by dominant hegemonic power, we mean, at least in part, one that is dominant militarily, and closely related to that, one that is dominant in economic terms. Military power in this regard is particularly important, according to realists, because of what they call the fungibility of military power. The fungibility of military power. In other words, fungibility doesn't have much to do with fungus, as one might suggest, but suggests merely that military power can serve to enhance other aspects of power. It can, through the imposition of various restrictions and so on, enhance the economic power of the state. And perhaps also other aspects of what might be called soft power, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, hegemonic powers in the international system that create such a open world order, a liberal world economy, don't merely do so, according to realists, in order to maximize their own interests, but at least to some extent do so in a way that benefits all participating states. In other words, the way that it is described is that a liberal world economic order, an open world economy, free of trade restrictions and so on, is analogous to what elsewhere we call the public good. The public good. Public goods are often also called the commons, such as the air that we breathe is a common good, is a public good that we all benefit from. But for our purposes, we're going to look at public goods in this context in a slightly different way. The air that we breathe is certainly a common good, as are the oceans and so on and so forth, but they are not common goods that are created by a particular state, although they might have to be maintained through state actions in current circumstances, but that raises different problems. A public good for our purposes is better understood through the analogy of something, for example, like the establishment of lighthouses. Now, lighthouses are to the benefit to everyone that is in a ship and that doesn't want to run on top of rocks. Consequently, states have a very strong interest in putting lighthouses around their various ports to mark where the entrances to harbors are, to mark where there are trouble spots. But there's no way that a state that puts up a system of lighthouses can exclude others from making use of those lighthouses. And furthermore, the fact that others use those lighthouses doesn't mean that they are diminished by the fact that somebody else is using them. It does, however, create some resentments in some cases, and that if you're benefiting from such a public good, those that bear the expense of creating that public good might have a strong interest in your contributing to the expense of those public goods, but may not necessarily have the ability to force you to do so. Meaning that there's always the possibility of free riders in that overall system. A liberal world economy is such a public good, in that a single state is required in order to create that, or has historically been required to create such an order, through creating the crucial institutions that are necessary in order for such a system to function. And we talked about that a little bit in the last class.